10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
When we think about the past, we tend to think in images. Photography was invented about 160 years ago, and there has been a practical photographic process for the last 140 years. Since then, it's provided us with a huge store of visual information about the way people lived and what the world looked like. Scotland has been extensively photographed since the earliest days, and Scottish photographers have made a unique contribution which continues to this day. We shall be looking at the world through the eyes and cameras of photographers with a strong Scottish connection. Either they were born here or they came to work in Scotland. In the Vale of Leven, one of the largest factories of its kind manufactures instant picture cameras. Almost fully automatic and with few controls to worry about, these cameras produce a picture in less than a minute after it's been taken. The photographer using the instant camera has a lot in common with his Victorian predecessor, who had to take everything he needed with him, both for taking the picture and for processing it. He had to do all the work himself, sensitizing the paper or plate and processing it all within a few minutes of actually taking the picture. So, like the instant photographer of today, the Victorians knew straight away whether or not the picture had been successful.
It took 8 hours to take the first successful picture in France in 1822, in lighting conditions which today would require only a fraction of a second. Modern colour films can be used in almost total darkness, and these new films for making slides can take photographs in conditions which 140 years ago would have required an exposure 100,000 times as long.
These factors affected the style of photography in the early days. As exposure times were long, only those things which didn't move could be photographed. When it came to photographing people in the early 1840s, an exposure time of half a minute was not unusual. To achieve a sharp image, posing was very important indeed. The subjects often had their eyes turned down so you couldn't see them blinking, and their position was fixed with uncomfortable neck and head clamps to stop their heads moving. The possibility of being able to make accurate portraits from life was so attractive to the Victorians, however, that they were prepared to submit themselves to such indignities and pay high prices for those small, delicate pictures. Before long, the newly discovered photographic process was being put to commercial use in Scotland. One of the first studios was opened in Glasgow's Buchanan Street in 1843. Scotland was free of the patent restrictions imposed south of the border, and many young photographers moved north to open their own studios.
Mr. Edwards, a cadet of the Adelaide Gallery in London, which has turned out some of the finest specimens of the art, has established his painting rooms, to speak in the old phrase, in a handsome saloon, 43 Buchanan Street, Glasgow, erected for the purpose, so that the light of day, which acts to him the part of a pencil, may have free and uninterrupted access. There, he has produced some very beautiful living portraits in the short space of a few seconds, and has even transferred prints and celebrated oil paintings. Not a few of his works contain all the severity of truth, and in addition, the form of a breastpin, the crease of a ruffle, or the petals of a flower which may be worn in the breast are most faithfully portrayed. In fact, the artist cannot fail to tell the truth. He can neither flatter nor detract from the appearance of the object which is presented to him. He is merely a secondary agent, and the work is painted with a pencil of light.
Mr. Edwards, with his Glasgow studio established, moved south again and opened a second studio in Dumfries.
As Mr. Edwards has pressing engagements to visit Russia, Prussia, etc., this may be the only opportunity of his being in Dumfries again, if ever, for a lengthened period of time.
Those engagements can't have been all that pressing, for within a few weeks he had opened another studio in Stirling, at Mrs. Stirling's Melville Terrace.
Itinerant photographers moving around the country certainly helped create a demand for photography. These early daguerreotype portraits are taken on silvered copper plates and are quite unique. And that meant that if they wanted copies, they had to photograph the original. This unique quality was marketed as making the photograph as important as the miniature painting, which to an extent it had replaced. And daguerreotypes were sold in the same lavishly made little velvet-lined cases as had been used for miniature paintings. That protection, with the pictures safe behind glass and kept in the dark, has made sure that they've survived for the last 140 years.
While photography was restricted by the unique image of the daguerreotype, the only real commercial use was portraiture. But that was soon to change, thanks to the calotype, the first photographic process to use a negative. It was the invention of Henry Fox Talbot, the Squire of Laycock in Wiltshire. Talbot's process was taken up by a group of enthusiasts in St Andrews, one of whom, Robert Adamson, teamed up with the painter David Octavius Hill to form one of the most successful Victorian photographic partnerships and still one of the best known today. Hill and Adamson had originally joined forces to make a series of photographs for a painting Hill had been commissioned to make. The Free Church of Scotland, which had just been established by a group of ministers dissenting from the Church of Scotland, commissioned a painting to celebrate their first gathering. Hill's creative genius and Adamson's technical skills combined to produce a huge number of single and group portraits from which Hill could construct his painting, making this one of the first applications of photography, the photograph being a means to an end rather than the end itself. The influence of the photographic originals can be seen throughout the painting, with the artist translating into paint all the detail and quality of the original photograph. Many great 19th century painters followed in Hill's footsteps, evolving canvases from sequences of photographic originals, among them Delacroix, Millet and Courbet. Hill's huge painting hangs in Edinburgh, and in its day many reproductions, prints and photographs of it were produced and sold throughout the country. While Hill and Adamson are certainly best known for their portraiture, their photography encompassed a much wider range, and included illustrations of scenes from the writings of Sir Walter Scott. Here are Edie Ochiltree and Miss Wardour from The Antiquary, in typical melodramatic pose. They also made topographical series taken throughout Scotland and the north of England, in all a rich store of marvellous photography. In many ways, they pioneered ideas and uses of photography which today we take for granted. One example is a series of historically invaluable pictures taken in Edinburgh in the mid-1840s. This was the age when railway lines were being opened up throughout Scotland, and buildings which had stood for centuries were being pulled down to make way for the advancing iron rails. One notable building that stood in the path of the tracks approaching Edinburgh's Waverley Station was the Collegiate Church of the Blessed Trinity, founded in 1462 by Queen Mary, widow of King James II. In the days long before preservation orders, a medieval church wasn't allowed to get in the way of progress, and a decision to knock it down was taken. The demolition went ahead in 1847. Perhaps it was more than just historical interest which prompted them to photograph the church. Even in the Victorian Industrial Revolution, its importance was such that the city fathers deemed it ought to be preserved. Each stone was numbered, careful drawings and plans made, and every modern aid brought to bear to ensure that the building could be rebuilt on a site 100 yards from the original, and perhaps Hill and Adamson's pictures were part of this plan. The numbered stones lay on Calton Hill for about 20 years, with the pile growing smaller as the stones found their way into the rockeries, coal sheds and garden walls of Edinburgh. By the time they came to start work on the rebuilding, there was only enough stone left to build the choir. So a new Victorian nave was added to the Gothic choir on the new site in Jeffrey Street. The nave has since been demolished. Now only a few contemporary engravings and paintings and Hill and Adamson's photographs survive to tell us what the building looked like on its original site. As well as Trinity Church, Lady Glenorchy's Chapel and Edinburgh's Orphan Hospital were to be razed to the ground. Hill and Adamson's cameras recorded them all to give us a priceless visual account of pre-railway Edinburgh. The Victorians, fascinated by anything new and even vaguely technical, were always eager for exciting variations on the simple photograph. The stereoscopic or three-dimensional photograph was one of the first innovations and soon caught on. Its effectiveness was due to the work of the eminent scientist Sir David Brewster in St Andrews. In 1856, Brewster published a book in which he laid down the principles of stereoscopic vision in human beings and how this could be reconstructed by means of two photographs. Stereo views were soon commonplace, and the delicate and expensive daguerreotype was replaced in the 1850s with paper prints. These examples are by Thomas Rogers of St Andrews. Brewster did not invent the stereoscope. This had been the work of Sir Charles Wheatstone. But thanks to him, smaller cameras were introduced which faithfully reproduced the stereo vision of the human eye. The camera either had a single lens, which was moved from one side to the other to allow two photographs to be taken in sequence, or twin lenses, making two exposures at the same time. With such a camera, Edinburgh's Princes Street was photographed in 1854, capturing distinctly for the first time people and carriages on the move. The freezing of movement had always proved a problem to the early photographers. It was the combination of a large lens and a small camera allowing for shorter exposure times that enabled Aberdeen photographer George Washington Wilson to take the first instantaneous pictures. When the French photographer Anton Disderi introduced the carte de visite in the late 1850s, this too developed into a collecting craze. The established photographers adapted their print size to fit the new format, so called because it was the same size as a visiting card. Landscape views, previously available as stereoscopic pictures, were reprinted to the new carte de visite size. and soon, collecting these, as well as portraits of family, friends and neighbours, the famous and infamous of the world, became a popular pursuit in mid-Victorian times. In 1861, James Clerk Maxwell, another Scot, made the first colour photograph. Maxwell took black and white pictures of a tartan ribbon through red, green and blue filters to prove his theory that all colours were made up of a mixture of those three. From the negatives, he made lantern slides and projected them through the three filters. When the three separate images were brought together on the screen, the tartan ribbon reappeared in something like its true colours. The quality was poor, but the world's first successful colour photograph had been made. For coloured prints, however, colour was still added to the black and white pictures. These photochromes from the 1890s are printed from hand-coloured originals, with up to 14 colours being used. It was not till the turn of the century, with the invention of the autochrome by Frenchmen Auguste and Louis Lumière, that colour photography became a practical proposition. Like Maxwell's process, the autochrome depended on the light from the subject being broken up into red, green and blue. A screen of tiny filters, dyed potato starch surrounded by lampblack, produced the granular quality of the autochromes. The delicate tones and tints create a soft, romantic mood. These examples are by James Russell, amateur photographer and member of the Edinburgh Photographic Society in the years before the Great War. These delightful studies are of the villages and fishing ports of the East Neuk of Fife. Urban renewal is not a new phenomenon. The Glasgow City Improvement Act of 1866 decreed that housing standards in the city had to be improved as soon as possible. This, together with the need to clear land for new railway lines, meant that considerable areas of the old city would disappear forever. Street lines were being altered, and the character of some areas was going to change completely. The trustees of the improvement scheme approached Thomas Annan, whose studio was in Hope Street, to produce a series of photographs before the demolition men moved in. Initially, he took 31 views in the closes and wynds behind the tenements where the poor people lived. Further photographic assignments between 1868 and 1877 contributed to a unique and rich series showing a Glasgow long disappeared. Annan's pictures marvellously capture the mood and atmosphere of these narrow closes and wynds. What Annan did for the old closes of Glasgow was also being done by other photographers throughout the country. A single studio operating in an area can give us a fascinating insight into the changes which have taken place since the 1860s. Wick Harbour is now used by a few fishing boats and oil rig support ships, but in 1863 it was the centre of a thriving herring fishing industry.
Come all you East Neuk fishing lads that stand in the prime of your youth. Come sit a while along with me, I'll tell ye all the truth. For I've lived nearby for all my days, along East Leinster too. I'm going near date, I burnt my breed on the cold hard herring ground. In the old troll boats and the lancey nets, I've used up all of my youth. Now the herring grounds nae mair fun along the shores of
The Johnston family has operated a studio in Wick since the early 1860s, with the business being passed down through 3 generations, finally closing a few years ago. This rich archive of photographs has survived for the simple reason that nobody thought to throw them out. Many old photographs reach us today by similar accident. This was the original Glasshouse studio. Alex Johnson Sr. was a plumber from Edinburgh who moved north in search of work, eventually turning his hobby into his profession and opening the town's first studio. With shops in Wick and Thurso, a collection of over 100,000 negatives, mostly on glass plates, was built up. The herring industry, in which so many livelihoods depended, is shown in several hundred negatives covering a 60-year span. Portraits of local people, the bread and butter of any professional photographer, account for tens of thousands of plates. Local crafts, coopering for instance, also provide a rich source of subjects. From a tender age, Victorians had a fascination with means of transport, and photographs taken inside and outside the studio provide a kind of running commentary on the latest models as they appeared on the scene. Bicycles were taking the shape we recognize today, and it was not long before motorbikes were all the rage. Motor cars, with number plates making them the earliest in the northeast of Scotland, were duly photographed, some for their proud owners, some simply because they were new. This is believed to be of a race leaving John O'Groats. This race between a car and a wheelbarrow was clearly designed to give the barrow a head start. The stone under the car's wheel is keeping it firmly in place. An air crash at the turn of the century obviously aroused keen local interest, while an earlier picture of the gold rush at Kildonnan was taken after Alex Johnson had dissolved his silver watch in nitric acid to make the silver nitrate he needed. All the major engineering projects in Scotland were covered by the best photographers. In 1877, the ill-fated Tay Bridge was opened. It was 2 miles long, a delicate structure carrying a single railway track. Both George Washington Wilson and James Valentine, whose Dundee studio was close at hand, photographed this colossal undertaking. On December the 28th, 1879, a train left Wormit Station in a heavy storm. It never reached the other side. Thanks to inferior ironwork, a great gap had been torn in the bridge by high winds. The train plunged into the river with a loss of 73 lives. Dundee was one of Scotland's most important cities, and the bridge was a vital trading link with the south. Decisions were quickly made to replace it with a new and stronger structure, and work on that was started in 1883 and completed 5 years later. Again, Valentine photographed the bridge, and his pictures show clearly how the new was built alongside the old, with the old bridge being used to transport the ironwork out to the new. Some of the larger sections were floated out, then raised into position on the old bridge before being swung across to the new. The year after the second Tay Bridge was opened, the fourth bridge also carried its first train. The spans of the fourth bridge, each over 1,700 feet across, made it the world's largest cantilevered span. Again, Valentine and Wilson were on hand to make a series of pictures which clearly show how the intricate ironwork of the bridge was fitted together. Seen in sequence, these photographs are an eloquent tribute to one of the major feats of Victorian engineering. Valentine's photographers did not limit their activities to photographing the major news stories in Scotland. Postcards, introduced around the turn of the century, were at first not confined to flattering views and sunsets. In Wigan, Lancashire, for example, Valentine's photographed local coal mines. This is Maypole Colliery. Later that same year they were back, photographing the crowds waiting outside the pit for news of the miners trapped underground after a major explosion. The mine was devastated. 75 miners died, only 4 were brought to the surface alive, and only 3 bodies. Valentines again were on hand to photograph the funeral of one of the victims. Sales from the Valentine postcards and from postcards made by local Wigan photographers were sold to raise money to help the widows and children of the dead miners. The fourth bridge may not be as busy as it was, but its impressive, highly distinctive appearance ensures that it continues to be one of the most photographed structures in Scotland.